At my own 37th birthday dinner in a private room overlooking the Atlantic, my mother leaned toward my younger sister and whispered 11 words she thought only Tandy could hear. I heard every one of them. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I picked up the knife in front of me and cut my own birthday cake smiling, while the woman who raised me tried to take everything I owned out from under me in real time. 20 minutes later, my sister walked back into that private room, her face a shade paler than the linen tablecloth in front of her. And under the table, my 7-year-old daughter leaned close enough that her breath barely disturbed the air between us and whispered, "Mom, did Aunt Tandy take your key?" She had no idea that the house they were trying to walk into no longer belonged to any of us the way they thought it did. If you've ever lived inside a drama family, the kind where love and leverage get tangled together until you can't tell them apart anymore, you already know exactly how that felt. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and hit follow if you've ever had to sit at a table and smile at the very people trying to take something from you. That's the part that still makes people go quiet when I tell it. Not the betrayal itself. Families betray each other every day in every corner of the world. What unsettles people is that I already knew. I had known for months. And while my mother thought she was 2 steps ahead of a woman she'd spent her whole life underestimating, I was already 5 years ahead of her because that's how long I had been quietly preparing for a night like this one, without a single person in my family noticing. My name is Kezia Molefe. I am 37 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that love was something you earned by giving until there was nothing left of you to give. I don't believe that anymore. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, the quiet ones, where the woman at the table already knows more than anybody realizes, stay with me, because tonight was only the beginning. Let me take you back to the start of that evening before any of it unraveled. It was late in the evening, the kind of soft, salt-scented night that only exists in Cape Town in the last weeks of summer. I had booked the private upper room at a restaurant in Sea Point, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows that turn the Atlantic into a long, dark mirror once the sun goes down. I had chosen this particular restaurant myself for reasons that had nothing to do with the view, though I hadn't told anyone that part yet and wouldn't, not for a while. The wind came in off the ocean in small, warm gusts every time a server opened the side door, carrying that specific smell of salt and kelp I've loved since I was a girl. The table was dressed simply, white linen, low candles, nothing showy. We'd ordered grilled king clip and a pot of boba tea, the way we always did for family birthdays, because some things don't need to change just because everything else does. In the center of the table sat a small cake with a single letter iced on top, just the letter K. I'd asked for it that way on purpose. No happy birthday Kezia in cursive icing, no photograph printed in frosting, just the one letter, because lately I had started to feel like that was all I had left of myself in this family. One letter, one name, mostly unspoken. My mother Zola sat to my right. 62 years old, dressed the way she always dressed for family occasions. Something bright, something with a bit of shine to it, a dress that looked like it belonged at a Sunday service rather than a birthday dinner. She wore the same warm, practiced smile she kept ready for pastors, for neighbors, for anyone who might be watching. I used to think that smile meant she was happy. It took me over 3 decades to understand it usually meant she wanted something. Across from me sat my younger sister Tandy, 32, 4 months pregnant, one hand resting on her stomach almost constantly, whether she needed to or not. She had a habit of touching her belly whenever she wanted the room to soften around her, whenever she wanted people to remember that she was carrying something precious and everyone else was simply furniture around it. To my left sat my daughter Nandi, 7 years old, feet swinging under her chair because they didn't yet reach the floor, eyes moving quietly from one adult to the next the way children do, when they've learned that the real conversation in a room often isn't the one being spoken out loud. Nandi doesn't miss much. She never has. The evening had been pleasant enough on the surface. Aunts and cousins raised their glasses. Someone made a small joke about how I'd turned 37 and still hadn't remarried, and I laughed along because that particular joke had lost its sting on me a long time ago. Then, in the middle of all that soft laughter and clinking glass, my mother leaned toward my sister. She kept her smile fixed on the table, on the guests, on anyone who might glance over, the same smile she always used, like a curtain. And she said quiet enough that she believed only Tandy could hear her, "While everyone's here, go and take the spare key from her bag right now. Have the locks at the Rondabosh house changed before midnight. You and Jabu need that space for the baby. She only has one child. She can manage." I did not turn my head. I did not put down my fork. I glanced once at my daughter, who was watching me carefully, and gave her the smallest shake of my head, a signal we built between us over the years, one that meant, "Not yet, baby, not yet." And then I looked back at my cake and kept smiling. Tandy rose a moment later, mumbling something about checking her phone, and walked slowly behind my chair on her way toward the door. I felt her hand slide into the side pocket of my bag. I felt the small metal weight of my spare house key lift out of it. I did not turn around. My mother continued, her voice a touch louder now, meant for the table. "Kezia, that house in Rondabosh is far too big for one mother and one child. Tandy is about to have another baby. Family has to share what it has." An aunt down the table nodded along. "That's right. What does a single woman need with all that space?" I answered calmly. "Nandi loves the backyard there." Under the tablecloth, my phone buzzed once against my knee. An alert from the security system at the Rondabosh house lit the screen. Motion detected at front door. Unknown male with locksmith tools. Vehicle registered to Jabu Nkosi, confined on site. I glanced without moving my head very much toward the empty chair where my sister's husband should have been sitting. He had not come back to the table yet. I pressed one finger gently to my lips and smiled again at the guests down the table, the picture of a woman celebrating her birthday, surrounded by family who loved her. Tandy came back to the table a few minutes later, her face a shade paler than before, holding her smile the way you hold a railing when the ground feels unsteady. My mother pulled her chair closer to mine. Her voice dropped into that sweetened register she used whenever she was about to ask for something she had no right to. "Kezia, sweetheart, Thandy already has 2 children, and now a third on the way. And you only have Nandy. That Rondabosh house is too much space for the 2 of you. Just let your sister and her family use it for now." Tandy began to cry softly, one hand pressed to her belly. "I'm scared there won't be enough room when the baby comes. Jabu drives for a living. We can't afford anything that size." An aunt further down the table chimed in. "Kezia lives alone. What does she need a big yard for? Let the children have it." That's the quiet architecture of a drama family. The sweetness and the ultimatum arrive in the same breath, delivered by the same smiling mouth. My eyes drifted almost by accident to the thin gold chain resting against my sister's collarbone. I recognized it instantly. It was the same chain I had pawned 4 years earlier to cover private school fees for her 2 older children, a debt I had never once mentioned again, because that's not the kind of thing you bring up at a birthday dinner. Or so I had believed until that moment. My phone buzzed again, a voice memo I'd started recording quietly the moment I sat down that evening, a habit I'd picked up a year ago after one too many family dinners that ended in a version of events nobody else remembered the same way was still running silently in my jacket pocket. But this buzz was something else. An old text message pulled back up from a cloud backup appeared on my screen. 4 years old. "Kezia, thank you for covering the children's school fees. I'll pay you back. Don't mention this to anyone. Zola." I looked at those words and understood something plainly. For what felt like the first time in years, my mother had never repaid a single cent. I turned the phone slightly, letting Nandi see the screen beneath the tablecloth. On it, a live feed from the Rondabosch camera showed Tandi arguing with two men in dark uniforms, while a third stood behind them holding a bag of locksmith tools. Nandi whispered, "Mom, Aunt Tandi got stopped." I nodded just barely. Jabu stood suddenly, saying he needed to step out. A few minutes later, a text arrived from him. "I already called it in. Don't worry." My mother's patience thinned. She pulled a printed document from her bag and slid it across the table. At the top, in bold letters, "Temporary occupancy transfer." "Sign it," she said. "It's only temporary, for your nephew, for your niece on the way." When I didn't move, she brought her hand down flat against the table for the first time that night. The silverware rattled against the porcelain. I had spent years being the person who quietly covered the gaps. School fees, hospital bills, rent when someone fell short, because I thought that's what a good daughter did. You gave and you didn't bring it up, and you certainly didn't ask for it back at dinner. But somewhere in those years, without ever announcing it, I had also started paying attention, writing things down, making sure the version of events living only in my memory also existed somewhere on paper, somewhere no one could talk their way around. And Uncle cleared his throat, sensing the shift in the room, but not quite brave enough to name it. My mother's sister murmured something to a cousin about how emotional pregnancy makes a woman, as if that could explain away the locksmith, the missing key, and the sudden document on the table. I did not touch the paper. I let it sit there blank at the bottom where a signature belonged, and I reached under the table for Nandi's hand and gave it one gentle squeeze, the kind that means, "Watch closely, this is almost over." My mother said, "Family has to share what it has." My sister said she was only scared for her unborn baby. So who's right here? Comment Team Zola if you think family always comes before what one woman built alone, or comment Team Kezia if you think blood doesn't hand anyone a key to somebody else's front door. Tandy stormed back into the private room a few minutes later, her face flushed, her braids disheveled from the wind outside. The side door hadn't fully closed behind her, and for a moment, the cold Atlantic air cut straight across the table, guttering the candles low enough that half the room fell into shadow before a server hurried over to shut it. She pointed a shaking finger at me in front of every guest at that table. "Did you call security on me? I'm pregnant." The room went silent. A few guests at the far end turned their heads. Somewhere behind me, a fork clinked against a plate and stopped midair, as if the person holding it had forgotten what they were doing. I set my phone down gently on the tablecloth, the screen still glowing with the live camera feed. I didn't rush. I let the silence sit there a beat longer than it needed to, the way I'd learned to do in board meetings years ago, because the person who speaks first in a room like that usually loses it. I spoke clearly enough for the whole room to hear. "Those weren't hired security, Tandi. They work for Malefe Property Management. That company is registered in my name." Someone's chair creaked. An aunt near the end of the table set down her wine glass without drinking from it, her eyes moving between Thandie and me like she was watching a tennis match she'd wandered into by accident. I continued, my voice steady. "And the house in Rondabosch hasn't been in my name for 5 years. It sits inside an irrevocable trust in Nandi's name. I'm only the trustee. Not even Mom has the authority to transfer anything about that property." Silence fell over the room, total and unbroken. Even the ocean outside seemed to quiet, or maybe it was only that every other sound had stopped competing with it. Nandi's small voice cut through it, clear as a bell. "You made that trust right after Grandma got better, right, Mom? You told me it was so nobody could ever take our house again." I felt something tighten in my chest, half pride and half old grief, hearing my 7-year-old repeat back a promise I'd made to her in a hospital hallway years ago, back when she was barely old enough to understand what a trust even was, only that Mommy had made something that meant safe. She'd asked me that night if the paperwork meant nobody could ever make us leave the house the way we'd almost had to once before. I'd told her yes. I hadn't expected her to still be carrying that promise around word for word 3 years later, ready to hand it back to me exactly when I needed it most. My daughter, without meaning to, had just told the entire family exactly when I'd started protecting what was mine. The same year I sold my car and gave up a scholarship to cover my mother's hospital bills. I looked my mother in the eye and said low but without hesitation, 5 years ago when you had your stroke, I sold the only car I owned and emptied what little retirement savings I had to cover your hospital costs. Tandy was traveling through Europe that summer on money I had wired her. I gave up a design scholarship at Cape Peninsula University of Technology to stay and take care of things. Nobody remembered that. Nobody thanked me for it. And tonight, you're still asking for more. My mother's hand resting on the table curled slowly into a fist around a linen napkin. I watched her knuckles whiten. It was such a small thing, and I don't think anyone else at the table noticed it, but I did, because I had spent 37 years learning to read that hand the way other people read faces. It was the same gesture she made whenever she was caught somewhere she hadn't planned to be caught, a tell she'd never once realized she had. I hadn't built that trust out of suspicion or some early plan for revenge. I built it out of fear. The plain, unglamorous fear of a woman who had just learned in a hospital hallway exactly how replaceable she was to the people she loved most. Underneath the calm voice I used that night was a much younger version of me, still terrified of being taken for granted, still hoping that if I just gave enough, someone would finally notice. The trust was never really about the house. It was the moment I stopped waiting to be noticed and started protecting myself instead. There's a version of that hospital summer I don't tell people because it doesn't make for a clean story. I remember sitting in a plastic chair outside the ICU at 2 a.m, still in my work clothes, doing math in my head about scholarship deadlines and hospital deposits, and realizing there was no version of that math that let me keep both. I remember calling the university the next morning and hearing my own voice stay perfectly calm while I withdrew from a program I'd wanted since I was 19. Nobody in my family ever asked what that call cost me. I never told them because some part of me still believed that if I explained the sacrifice out loud, it would stop counting as one. My mother rose from her chair, her face contorted, one finger jabbing toward me. The motion knocked her wine glass half an inch across the tablecloth, leaving a thin red smear like a hesitation mark. You kept this from your own family? You think you're clever? Jabu walked back into the room at that moment, his expression serious, his shirt still faintly damp at the collar from standing outside in the wind. He looked at his wife, then at his mother-in-law, and for a moment he seemed to be weighing something, the way a man does right before he says a sentence he can't take back. I've known about the trust for 3 months, he said, and I told Kezia about the plan to change the locks. Tandy turned to her husband as if she'd been struck. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but nothing came out. Somewhere down the table, a cousin murmured something under her breath to the person beside her and was quickly hushed. Every drama family has one member who keeps the receipts, literally or otherwise. I had become that person without ever meaning to. I think if I'm honest, Jabu had quietly become a second one, a man who'd married into all of this only a few years ago and had spent that whole time watching, saying little, deciding for himself which version of the family story he actually trusted. The room stayed frozen a moment longer, the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind you can feel pressing against your ears. Near the door, a member of the waitstaff hesitated, unsure whether to step in. I gave the smallest shake of my head and they stepped back, understanding this needed to finish on its own. My mother's chest was heaving. Her breath came in short, uneven pulls, the kind I recognized from years of watching her manage rooms, except this time the room wasn't cooperating. 5 years, she said, almost to herself, quiet enough that I don't think she meant anyone to hear it at all. 5 years you've been planning this. I wasn't planning revenge, I said. I was protecting my daughter. There's a difference, even if you've never learned it. Tandy lowered herself back into her chair, tears sliding freely now, looking at her husband as if she no longer recognized him. Beside her, her hand had drifted back to her belly, but for the first time all night, the gesture looked less like performance and more like something she genuinely needed to hold on to. For a moment, nobody moved. The candle between us had burned down almost to the base, its flame trembling slightly every time the side door let in another breath of wind. I reached under the table and found Nandi's hand again, and she squeezed back immediately, like she'd been waiting for me to need it. I want to say something honest about that pause, the one that stretched out after Jabu's confession and before anything else happened. It's easy, telling this story after the fact, to make it sound like I felt strong in that silence. Mostly what I felt was tired. The specific tiredness of finally saying out loud, in front of witnesses, things I'd carried alone for years. There's a strange grief in being believed. Some part of me had almost gotten used to not being. There's one more turn still coming tonight, and it's the one nobody at that table saw arriving. The room was still frozen from what Nandi had said from what Jabu had just done when my mother opened her mouth to speak again. Her lips had already parted, one hand half lifted off the table, and I watched her searching for the sentence that might pull the room back onto her side, the way she always could, the way she'd done my entire life. I didn't let her. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin brown folder I'd carried with me all evening, waiting for a moment I hoped I wouldn't need, but had prepared for anyway. The folder had sat against my hip all night through the toast and the joke about my age and the whisper I wasn't supposed to hear, a quiet weight I'd almost forgotten was there until now. I opened it on the white tablecloth and laid the pages down one at a time, slowly enough for everyone to see exactly what they were looking at. The paper made a small, dry sound against the linen, and in a room that quiet, even that sounded loud. The first page, a copy of a mortgage agreement taken out against the house and act loan, the home my grandparents had left behind, the one piece of property in our family that had never belonged to any one person but had always been meant to hold all of us. The second page, a signature, my name written in a hand that was almost mine, close enough to pass a glance, wrong enough that anyone who'd actually watched me sign anything 100 times would know immediately it wasn't. I remember staring at it again under that low candlelight, noticing the same small tell I'd half registered months earlier and dismissed at the time. A curl at the end of the K that leaned the wrong direction. The kind of detail you only catch if you're looking for a lie instead of a name. The third page, a bank confirmation dated 6 weeks earlier showing the loan had already been paid off in full by me, quietly, before I ever said a word to anyone about it. My mother used a forged signature of mine to take out a loan so Tandy could open a hair salon, I said, my voice steady. I reported it to the bank's fraud department a month ago once I'd finished paying it off and had the paperwork in order. It's been under investigation ever since. Tandy sank back into her chair, both hands pressed to her belly, her face drained of color. Beside her, an aunt who had been nodding along all night now sat very still, staring at the tablecloth like it might offer her somewhere else to look. At that moment, my mother's phone, still lying on the table from earlier, its speaker somehow still switched on, lit up, and began playing an old voice memo, one she had sent to Tandy 2 years before. Her own voice filled the private room, tinny through the small speaker, but unmistakable. Don't worry, I'll sign Kezia's name for you. The bank won't check that closely, just this once. For a second, nobody breathed. Then my mother lunged across the table fast enough to knock her own wineglass over completely this time, a thin red stain spreading fast across the white cloth like something opening. What made that voice memo so damning wasn't the fraud itself. It was how casual she sounded saying it, like a woman who had convinced herself that love excuses theft as long as it stays inside the family. My mother's whole life had been built on being needed, on being the one who solved things. And somewhere along the way, she'd confused control with love so thoroughly she could no longer tell the difference. She wasn't trying to destroy me that night. She was terrified of becoming irrelevant to the very people she'd spent her life managing. I think about my mother's own mother sometimes, a woman I only knew as a child, stern and proud and impossible to please, who used to say that a family that doesn't need each other isn't really a family at all. I never got to ask my mother how much of that voice she still carried inside her own, but I've wondered since that night whether the woman who raised me learned very young that being useful was the only currency safe enough to trade in, and whether somewhere underneath 62 years of practiced smiles, she was still that same frightened girl, just older, just better at hiding it behind pearls and Sunday dresses. The voice rang out clearly enough that at least 10 people around that table heard every word. Tandy's mouth opened, but nothing came out. My mother silenced the phone at last, her hand trembling slightly against the screen. But the damage was already done. Witnessed, remembered. I looked at my sister crying now and said something I had carried in my chest for 2 years without letting out. At your wedding 3 years ago, in front of more than 50 relatives, Mom stood up and said I got divorced because I didn't know how to keep a husband, and that all I knew how to do now was raise a child alone. I smiled. I kept pouring wine for your guests all night so the wedding wouldn't be ruined. I hadn't planned to say that part. It came out of somewhere older than the folder on the table, somewhere I'd kept sealed for 3 years because bringing it up at the time would have made me the one who ruined my sister's wedding, and I had already decided long before that night that I would rather carry an insult quietly than be the reason a celebration fell apart. Saying it out loud now finally felt less like an accusation and more like setting down a stone I'd been carrying in my shoe for 3 years without ever taking off my shoe to check. The restaurant's manager stepped quietly into the room and bowed his head toward me. Miss Malefe, per your instructions, will prepare the bill and assist your guests in departing if needed. The table went still all over again for a different reason this time. A cousin near the far end actually looked around the room at the windows, at the low lighting, at the private door we'd walked through hours earlier without a second thought, as if seeing the space itself for the first time. Every person there finally understood that the private room they'd been celebrating in all night, the whole restaurant in fact, was part of a chain I held a silent stake in. I'd chosen this venue on purpose months ago for exactly the kind of evening I'd hoped never to need. My mother's mouth kept moving, but no sound came out anymore. She sat back down slowly, the fight going out of her all at once, the way a held breath finally leaves a body. Beside me, Nandi didn't say a word. She simply reached over and took my hand, holding it tightly, grounding me the way she always had a way of doing without needing to be told. It was the only thing in that room that felt steady. I looked down at her small hand wrapped around mine and thought, not for the first time that night, that whatever else I had built or lost or fought for in the last 5 years, I had at least built one thing right, a daughter who reached for my hand instead of away from it. I gathered the folded clothes and set it on the table within easy reach in case anyone needed to look again. Nobody did. The candle between us had gone out completely by then, just a thin curl of smoke rising in the low light, and nobody moved to relight it. This is what happens when a drama family finally runs out of secrets to keep. The night wasn't finished teaching this family anything yet. I rose slowly from my chair, and for one long second, the whole room seemed to hold its breath with me. The candles had burned low enough that their light no longer reached the corners of the room, just our faces lit from below like people telling ghost stories. Somewhere behind me, a server hovered near the door, afraid to come closer, afraid to leave. The wind found the cracked side door again and carried in that same smell of salt and kelp that had greeted us hours earlier, except now it felt less like a welcome and more like the room exhaling. I pulled Nandi close against my side. Her hand found mine before I even reached for it. She had always done that, ever since she was small enough to ride on my hip. Like some part of her had learned to read the exact second I needed steadying more than she did. There was a version of me a long time ago who would have apologized into a silence like that one just to make it end faster. That version of me learned young, 11 years old, 3 days after my father's funeral, that in every family, somebody has to be the one who keeps track of what's owed and what's already been spent, because grief is beautiful and loud and it does not pay the electricity bill. My mother grieved beautifully that year. The whole congregation said so. I sat at the kitchen table with an old ledger book I didn't fully understand yet because somebody had to, and I have never once told her that part. I looked at my mother one last time, my voice calm enough that it seemed to unsettle her more than any amount of shouting could have. The house in Rondebosch was sold 30 days ago. Every cent from that sale sits inside Nandi's trust. The new owners arrive tomorrow morning. There's nothing left for anyone to take. My mother sank back into her chair. Her hand found the edge of the table and gripped it, knuckles pale against the white cloth. You sold the house? 2 years ago, I said quietly. A design firm in Johannesburg called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because I was standing in the Rondebosch kitchen with flour on my hands and Nandi was doing homework at the counter. They offered me a creative director position 3 times what I was making here. I said yes before I'd even hung up the phone. I told you that same night at this same kind of dinner table, and you cried until I promised I'd stay. You said the family needed me. I turned it down the next morning. I stayed in Cape Town for 2 more years after that phone call, and this is how the family repaid me. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the ice shifting in someone's water glass 3 seats down. Some part of me wanted to believe her even then. That's the hardest thing nobody tells you about walking away from a parent who's hurt you. The guilt doesn't disappear just because the boundary is right. I wasn't fighting my mother in that moment as much as I was fighting the little girl inside me who still wanted her approval more than she wanted her own safety. Choosing my daughter over that old hunger for a mother's love was the quietest, hardest decision I made all night. I think somewhere underneath her anger, my mother was fighting a version of herself too, a woman who had learned decades before I was born that being needed was the only kind of love she ever felt sure of. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it explained finally why she'd never once stopped to ask if I was tired. My mother reached for my hand, her eyes wet, her composure finally cracking. I was wrong, my child. It was only for the sake of my grandchild. Please don't bring the police into a family matter. I gently freed my hand from hers without anger, without hesitation. I bent down, kissed the top of Nandi's head, and turned toward the door. Jabu stood off to one side and gave me a small, silent nod. Tandi sat frozen, tears falling out of anything left to say. We walked out of the private room together, Nandi's hand in mine, past the main dining floor where other guests sat under warmer, easier light, laughing about things that had nothing to do with us. None of them looked up. None of them had any reason to know that the woman walking past their table in a plain black dress held a silent stake in the very floor beneath their feet. A young hostess near the entrance caught my eye and gave a small knowing nod, the kind you give someone you've been quietly instructed to look after, and I nodded back. Outside, the night had cooled the way it always does in Sea Point once the sun is truly gone, the Atlantic wind pulling at the hem of my dress and the ends of Nandi's braids. A valet brought the car around without needing to be asked twice. I opened the back door, buckled Nandi in myself instead of letting her do it the way I always did on nights when I needed my hands to be doing something small and useful. Mom? She said once we were both inside, once the door had shut out the wind and the restaurant lights had shrunk to a soft gold smear in the side mirror. Are we going to be okay? We're already okay, I told her. We have been for a while. Tonight just made it easier for other people to see. She was quiet for the length of 2 streetlights, watching the ocean slide by on her side of the car, black and endless under a thin moon. Then she asked in the small, careful voice she used when she already suspected the answer mattered more than the question. Is Grandma going to be in trouble? That's not up to me anymore, I said. It's up to the bank and to her and to choices she made a long time before tonight. My job was never to punish her. My job was just to make sure she couldn't take anything else from us. As I reached for the door handle, the restaurant manager approached and quietly pressed a thin white envelope into my hand. I opened it right there under the porch light, while the valet waited a respectful distance away. Inside was a notarized copy of the Rondabach sale agreement, nothing new. But beneath it was a letter from the bank's fraud unit dated 3 weeks earlier, confirming that the same forged signature used for Tandy's salon loan had also been used on a second loan, one taken against the house in Athlone. The letter noted the case had already been escalated to the bank's legal department with a formal hearing scheduled for the following month. Clipped to it was a short, handwritten note from my attorney. Tonight's recording has been added to the existing file. It won't change the timeline, but it will make sure nothing about tonight gets forgotten or explained away later. You don't need to do anything further. I read that last line twice. You don't need to do anything further. I had spent 5 years being the only person keeping a record of my own life, and there was something almost disorienting about being told in plain handwriting that I could finally stop. I folded the envelope and slipped it into my bag. There was no dramatic promise that my mother would lose her house by morning. That was never how any of this worked, and I'd stopped expecting instant justice a long time ago. What I had instead was proof. Proof that would sit quietly in a file the way I had sat quietly for years, waiting for the moment it would matter. I offered no further explanation. I didn't look back one final time. I simply took Nadi's hand and walked out into the hallway, leaving behind a room that was quietly falling apart in silence, and the sound of my mother's crying trailing after us. I want to be honest about something before we get to what came next. Walking away in a moment like that doesn't feel like winning. What I felt moving down that hallway with my daughter's hand in mine was something closer to relief. The particular relief of finally setting down a weight I'd carried so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. I didn't feel joy watching my mother's face collapse, or satisfaction watching my sister realize her husband had chosen honesty over her secrets. There is no part of me that celebrates a family falling apart, even a drama family that had spent years quietly taking more from me than it ever gave back. But there's a difference between wanting to see people suffer and simply no longer being willing to let them take from you. It took me a long time to understand that protecting your own future isn't an act of revenge. It's the bare minimum of what you owe yourself. Outside, the sound of the ocean was still faintly audible through a cracked window. Nandi looked up at me solemn in the low hallway light and didn't ask me anything else. She just held my hand a little tighter, the way children do when they understand better than most adults give them credit for, that something important had just ended and something else was about to begin. The drive home ran along the coast road, the ocean, a long, dark shape on one side, and the city lights climbing the mountain on the other. Neither of us turned on the radio. Somewhere past Camps Bay, Nandi finally fell asleep against the window, her breathing slow and even, one hand still loosely curled in mine across the console. I kept my eyes on the road and let myself feel for the first time all night exactly how tired I was. That night, Nandi and I went home to a new apartment in Greenpoint, the one I had quietly bought with my own money 2 months earlier without telling a single soul in my family. I hadn't told her yet either. I carried her up from the car half asleep, her cheek against my shoulder, and when I finally set her down inside and turned on the lights, she blinked around at the bare white walls, the still unpacked boxes stacked neatly by the window, and asked in a voice thick with sleep, "Whose house is this?" "Ours," I said, "as of tonight." She was quiet for a moment, taking that in, the way children do, not with questions, yet just with looking. Then she walked, still half in a dream, straight to the window, because even at 7 years old, she already understood which view mattered. The apartment looked straight out over the water, the city lights scattered along the coastline in the distance, small and steady. There were no guests waiting there, no chandeliers, no hushed whispers passed behind polite smiles, just quiet, and the smell of fresh paint still faintly in the air, and one box in the corner I hadn't unpacked yet, the one with Nandi's old drawings from the Rondebosch house, the crayon suns and stick figure families she used to leave taped to the refrigerator. I'd packed that box myself, carefully, the week the sale went through, because some things you carry with you, even when you leave everything else behind. Nandi and I sat down on the kitchen floor and spread out a small dish towel between us, the way we always did when we cooked together. We mixed banana bread batter side by side, the simplest thing I knew how to make, the one Nandi had loved since she was barely old enough to hold a spoon. She insisted on cracking the eggs herself, and a bit of shell went into the bowl, and we both laughed for the first time all night while I fished it out with a spoon. Flour dusted the front of her pajamas, a small white handprint on her sleeve where she'd wiped her hand without thinking. The smell of sugar and ripe banana slowly filled the small kitchen, warm and ordinary, nothing like the cold, careful air of the private room we'd left behind. Nandi sat quietly for a long moment before she asked, her voice smaller than it had been all evening. "Mom, does Grandma still love you?" I stopped stirring and looked at my daughter for a while before answering her honestly. "Grandma loves in her own way, but I've chosen to love you in a way that doesn't cost you anything you can't afford to lose." She thought about that with the particular seriousness only a 7-year-old can manage, batter dripping slowly off the spoon in her hand. "Is that why you made the trust so nobody could ever take this from me?" "That's exactly why," I said. "You don't have to understand all of it right now. You just have to know that no matter what happens to me, the roof over your head, the ground under your feet, that part is already yours. Nobody gets to argue about that at a dinner table." She nodded slowly, the way she did when she decided to believe something completely, then reached up and wrapped both arms around my neck, batter-covered hands and all. I held her back, feeling her small, steady breath against my shoulder, and didn't mind at all about the flour getting into my hair. For the first time in longer than I could easily remember, my chest didn't feel heavy anymore. Later, after the bread was in the oven and Nandi was finally properly asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the thin brown folder open in front of me one last time. The mortgage papers, the forged signature, the bank letter, the note from my attorney. I read through it once, slowly, by the light over the stove, and then I closed it and put it away in a drawer instead of my bag because it no longer needed to travel with me everywhere I went. That, more than anything that happened at the restaurant, felt like the actual ending. Every drama family carries old wounds forward until somebody finally decides to set them down instead of handing them to the next generation. A few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat on the small balcony with a cup of tea, watching the light shift over the water. My phone buzzed once, face down on the table. It was a short message from Jabu. "Things are calmer here. Tundi's seeing someone about the salon about a lot of things. Thank you for not making this harder than it had to be." I didn't answer right away. I just let the tea go lukewarm in my hands and watched a ferry cut a slow white line across the bay and felt for once no urge to fix anything for anyone. Nandi hummed to herself at the kitchen table behind me in no hurry at all. Safe in a home no one could pull out from under her. This story reminds us that blood is not a license to take, and that protecting your own future is not betrayal. It's simply what you owe yourself. If you're a little further down the road than Kezia and you've spent years being the one everyone else leaned on, here's what I'd tell you over coffee at your own kitchen table. Write down what you've given and what's been promised back, even in a plain notebook, not to keep score, but because memory alone lets other people rewrite history. If a name isn't on the deed, the will, or the account, it isn't legally yours to promise away, No matter how many family dinners say otherwise, a short visit to a local attorney or your bank's trust office can tell you exactly where you stand, usually for less than you'd think. Call one grown child or grandchild this week, not to relitigate old wounds, but just to hear their voice. Relationships stay warm through small, regular contact, not grand gestures. And if someone in your family still treats your patience as permission you're allowed to say the sentence, "That doesn't work for me anymore," and mean it the same quiet way Kezia did. Peace, it turns out, isn't something you wait for. It's something you build one honest boundary at a time.